Thank you so much, Glenda. Sonia, it's good to have you back on Sunday Brunch. Good to see you.
Thank you, April. It is wonderful to be here.
For this episode of Sunday Brunch, we are having all of our guests reflect on the legacy of Reverend Jesse Jackson. We obviously truly lost a giant this week, and definitely in your role as a veteran political journalist, can you talk a little bit about the legacy of Jesse Jackson and what stands out to you most?
Oh my goodness, how much time do you have? Well, in many ways, Jesse Jackson operated like a de facto president, uh, just sort of a presidential political presence for Black America. When I covered the Clinton White House, he was a constant, steady presence. Whenever there was a major issue cooking, he came to speak directly to the president about it. He wasn't the only one who did that. There were multiple leaders from his era who accessed the president to speak up on behalf of what the impact on Black Americans would be, or on Americans of color, or on Americans who were disadvantaged. They leveraged their own platform to come in and speak to the president and hopefully influence policy. So he was a steady presence in the Clinton years in the White House. I recall taking a tour of Native American reservations with Clinton, maybe sometime around I don't know, mid 1990s. And Reverend Jackson was with him on that tour. And, he was such an outsized presence that when President Clinton was working rope lines and greeting crowds at various places in Indian country, Jesse Jackson was more popular, and the people were swarming him and coming to him. And in talking to people just on the ground there, many of them recalled the Rainbow Coalition and the efforts to register voters and to get people in Native communities and tribal communities excited about participating in the election. So they loved him there. And it was so he was so omnipresent. He had his own vehicle in the presidential motorcade. Every vehicle beyond the limos and all that were labeled. The media vans were labeled, Wire One, Press One, etc., Staff One. Jesse Jackson's vehicle was labeled Special One, and that just stayed with me. I noticed often he was the only person getting in and out of that vehicle, which was a town car, but it was labeled Special One. Now, how many people do you know, political figure or whatever type of figure, could leverage their own Special One vehicle in a presidential motorcade? That was Jesse Jackson. He was a self-appointed envoy. He went into dangerous, dangerous situations and negotiated the release of hostages. He negotiated terms, brokered terms. I remember speaking with him about his efforts in Yugoslavia to secure the release of Americans in Yugoslavia. So he was special, and he operated differently from any way that anybody prior had operated. He, in terms of his oratory and articulating what was best for the overall good, he filled that breach when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. The oratory that he delivered filled the gap. And that's not to say any other leaders were not good preachers or capable. It's just that gap, that breach that got violated there. He filled it with ringing, legendary oratory that has moral authority to it still to this day. So they say familiarity breeds contempt, and Jesse Jackson was a very familiar presence in our public life, as permanent a fixture as any of the monuments in this nation's capital. So then naturally was contempt for the man, for his flaws, for his inabilities to deliver certain things or to be a certain type of person. But I do think that with his passing, this nation will come to realize what it had in him and hopefully will not suffer for the lack of him.
No, absolutely, Sonia. Thank you so much for that reflection. We're both members of the National Association of Black Journalists, and I have loved in recent days seeing my timeline full of the memories of Jesse Jackson. And I mean, from old school journalists to younger journalists, the people that he touched, the people that he sat down with, just the access. I do think a lot of our modern day politicians can learn a lot from a Reverend Jesse Jackson, that he was just really so available, and you definitely consider the media a tool, and definitely would sit down with mainstream journalists, with black journalists. And was interested in hearing more from you, because I have had a chance to talk with some, we call them old heads in NWJ, some of our old head journalists, but just the kind of access that people had to him, especially when he ran for president in 84 and 88. I know that for a lot of those young black journalists at the time was their first time covering a presidential. They got to go out with him on the bus and go with him in travel. And just wanted to talk a bit more about his legacy, especially for black journalists, and what that meant to see someone get as far as he got on the campaign that he got, but also was able to cover it as well.
Now, one thing about his generation of civil rights leaders is that they were big believers in uplifting Black journalists and talking to us. They understood, maybe because some of them came out of a media background as well. They understood the importance of access to sources that knew what was going on, and he was one of those. I was one of those brand new green as grass reporters out there in the late 1980s. I was working for AP in Atlanta, and the 1988 Democratic National Convention was in Atlanta. So AP did with me what they do with young reporters. They said, "Oh, go cover the parties," you know. So I said, "Okay, I'm covering the convention, and I'm going to be covering the parties." And I didn't even know where the parties were, but I managed to locate Jesse Jackson roaming around the convention venue, and I just followed the man. I did find out about a few parties and whatnot, but the thing that Jesse Jackson did for me in that space was introduce me to Ron Brown, who was, as you know, very eminent figure in the Democratic Party at the time, and also tethered to Jesse Jackson's campaign and his efforts on delegates. So Jesse Jackson entered the 1988 convention with a big chunk of delegates under his control, and they were delegate brokering to influence the party platform. So this little girl right here, who was supposed to be covering parties, wound up getting good sourced information out of two of the biggest figures at the Democratic Convention at that time, who were deeply involved in the effort to structure the party platform. And in the end, Dukakis got the nomination, but Jesse Jackson's fingerprints were all over the convention platform. If you go back and look at the things that the Democrats had to promise, which of course ended up, I don't know, being uh, tabled a bit because George H.W. Bush won the election. But it laid a foundation that paved the way for Bill Clinton in 1992. And Bill Clinton's platform, when he came through the door, also had Jesse Jackson and Ron Brown's fingerprints all over it. That is an example of the power of Jesse Jackson. And I honestly, he really could have been very mean to me. At the time, I had written a story about the silence from many of the civil rights era leaders in Atlanta when it came to endorsing his candidacy. They had said nothing. And so for me, the question became, well, why have you not endorsed him. Not really, are you going to endorse him, but why haven't you done it before now? And the silence spoke loudly. There were only two activists who were willing to speak to me about him, and they were the late Reverend Hosea Williams and the late Reverend Jim Bevel. And both of them talked about the hard feelings behind Jackson's behavior around the time King was assassinated, which is a big deal. So he really had the option of saying, I don't want to talk to you. You just wrote that crap about me. But what Jesse Jackson did understand is the news organization I worked for was the biggest megaphone in the room, and he knew how to work the megaphone. If he had something that he wanted amplified, that he wanted said, he said, I could tell it to the AP and it'll go wherever it's supposed to go. So we did enjoy a very long, involved reporter source relationship. And I spoke to him about numerous things that were going on in America at the time. He became more of a touchstone than anything else. And I mean, he went to Africa with Bill Clinton because, of course, he did. Bill Clinton was not going to be able to go to Africa without Jesse Jackson, if you think about it. And he suggested to one of my colleagues, April Ryan, uh, as we puzzled over what our presence as African Americans on that tour meant, he suggested we do a libation ceremony. So we talked about it. We hadn't planned much of anything. We didn't know what we were going to libate with. And I had a bottle of Poland Spring water in my backpack bag. So when we were preparing to go in Senegal to Gorée Island, I approached Reverend Jackson and asked him would he pray over this bottle of Poland Spring that we were going to use for our libation ceremony. And he didn't say no, but he didn't say yes. Instead, he launched into he launched into rhetoric about how our presence in Africa in that moment in time amounted to full circle triumph for our ancestors. And it empowered us to go out onto the I don't want to say deck, but the outer edge of that slave house on Gorée Island and speak our ancestors' names, the names we knew, and acknowledge the ones who we never knew. But walking in there knowing, yeah, I'm triumphant, and why didn't I think of that? Is the value of Jesse Jackson.
Oh, that's amazing, Sonia. Thank you so much for sharing that. I'm going to make a jump because we are talking about Jesse Jackson and his report, the press, and the importance of press, obviously. And I want to talk about what's been happening more recently in Minneapolis. For example, we have seen in recent weeks Don Lemon, black journalist Georgia Fort, and others were arrested while covering protests in Minneapolis. As someone who has covered presidents, wars, moments of national crisis, what was your first reaction to these arrests?
My first reaction was, this is nothing new. It is the latest permutation of what's been done to Black journalists throughout history. I mean, there are multiple examples of abuse of authority, of I mean, failure to even acknowledge our legitimacy in the midst of reporting on things. I mean, let's not forget, there was a CNN reporter, Omar, I believe his last name is Jimenez. Omar was arrested while covering Black Lives Matter protests. Wesley Lowery was harassed by the police and arrested while covering protests. Simeon Booker was chased out of Mississippi for literally breaking the story of what happened to Emmett Till. This has gone on for a long time. William Monroe Trotter was arrested and spent 30 days in jail for being a public nuisance, showing up at Booker T. Washington's expository or speech somewhere and publicly calling him an Uncle Tom. He spent 30 days not in prison, but in jail for this. So it is not new to us. It's simply something we haven't seen in a long time. And we realize now we have to get our back strong for that. We have to just be prepared for that because Black people often become the lightning rod for whatever it is that this country wants to act out on humanity. They come for us every time. I've said for a number of years now that the condition of the Black journalist in American newsrooms has gone beyond mere individual instances of discrimination into a full blown human rights crisis. There is just always been this effort to undercut our ability to exist in newsrooms. So again, it is nothing new to us. It is unfortunate. I'm so sorry. It happened to Don and to Georgia. It should not have, but every journalism organization in this country needed to be standing up and vehemently objecting to what has happened to them. And I'm glad so many have. I do think that it was a test, see what else they could get away with, like anything else. But we just have to be resolute in dealing with it and addressing it.
No, absolutely. And thank you for, during this Black History Month, all the names that you just mentioned, uplifting those names that have come before us, that you're right, this is not new, that they have experienced. I want to do one last question on this. You know, for this go round of targeting Black journalists, they went after independent journalists, they went after freelance journalists. And then in the same vein, in recent weeks, we've seen decimation of the Washington Post, and we're seeing, you know, major news institutions, especially under, you know, this president, folding. There's more of a reliance on freelance journalists and than ever before, who's exactly who they targeted. Can you talk to us just a bit about, as a closing thought, is what happens in this country when we're seeing the demise of major news organizations and we're seeing the freelance journalists under attack that sometimes don't have the protection that that a mainstream publication would provide? What happens to a democracy when journalists can't report freely and they don't have any protections to make sure that this important stories are being told?
Well, there's a radical side to me, April, who that feels that in many ways what's happening in legacy media is the final collapse of cracks and fissures that have been in that structure for a very long time. Legacy media has never been good or friendly about uh, the voices of individual journalists. There's always been this desire to control how you behave, how you present, what you say. In many cases, those of us who were in legacy organizations were told outright, you can't express an opinion. You have to couch this under impartial verbiage. You cannot just say, well, I think this or that. And you also have to be cautious. I'm sure you recall the many admonitions that we all got as journalists when the president of the United States would come to the NABJ convention. We were told you can't applaud or clap for him. You can't cheer. You can't look like you're taking his side. When the truth about impartiality and clarity and lack of bias in American journalism is they wanted you to prove that you could suppress your Black self in order to be honest about what's happening. Well, what's happening right now requires the very honesty that being Black equips us with. So the independent journalist is a natural lightning rod for this. It isn't just a Black thing. It's across the board with so many of us. But the very experience of your personal identity informing your journalism is what they are afraid of the most. And it's just something that's got to play out because unfortunately the fourth estate responsibilities have been collapsing for a long time. And the main pillar that's still propping that fourth estate up are independent journalists, you see. And they understand that. And I think in the end, the independence of messaging is going to win.
Yeah. No, thank you so much for that. As always, we love having you on Sunday Brunch. We look talk to you forever. We got to have you back. But thank you again, Sonia, for stopping by and brunching with us.
And
And
thank you,
Glenda, back
April.
to you. Go ahead.
I said I always enjoy my time with the Sisters of Higher Heights.
Oh, good. Yay, we love it. We love it. Thank you again, Sonia. Glenda, back to you.